Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from Alex Merced Coder, and in the previous video we had deployed our Rails API. So now we need to make the front end. Okay, and then we're gonna make that with React. So back in the first video, we did spin up our React project. Keep opening up the wrong window. Okay, our React project. So that should be in our front end folder. Okay, this is not using Create React App. This is actually using what's referred to as Create React Basic. It's a template that I made. That's just a basic React template. Okay, so it's not exactly set up the way that Create React Basics file structure is. Almost identical, but not exact. It's basically a slimmer version with less bells and whistles, so you don't have like ESLint and stuff like that. So instead of being 160 megabytes per install, it's about 60, 80 megs. But we're gonna make it bigger because we're gonna install some stuff. Okay. So what I'm going to do, let me think about how I want to do this. You know what? I'm going to set up a global state. So let's just set up all our boilerplate for our project. So we're gonna need router because I'm gonna want router. I'm gonna want to send people to different routes, but I'm gonna keep the state pretty simple because I'm gonna actually just literally just make one global state. Again, it's not something you should always do because again, there are benefits to having your state. And again, I'm assuming you've used React before. So if this is your introduction to React, then you should probably watch my introductory React videos first. But having your state in your components, one, makes your components more reusable. And two, also makes it where there isn't as many unnecessary renders of components. But sometimes you have a large, complicated project, and it might be worth setting up sort of central state location to put some of your state in there. Okay, don't get sloppy and just put all your state in the application level state. Okay, so I will show you how we set that up. So we're gonna set that up today. So we're gonna set up router, and we're gonna set up context and use reducer to have sort of that application level state. Okay, which essentially is going to work the same way as if you had used Redux. Okay, so first let's set up router. Okay, so we're going to do install npm install router, or it's React router. And actually I'm in the backend folder still. So cd out of that, cd into the front end folder. And what I want to do is actually first we have to do an npm install because I don't think I've installed all the previous dependencies yet because we just spun up the template without doing the install. So running npm install, it's installing all the existing required libraries. Good. And I want to install React router and React router DOM. Those are the two libraries I need to make React router work. Cool. And this is a pretty quick setup. So we go to our source. We're going to head over to our index.js. We are going to import browser router as router because we don't want to call it browser router. That's just too much typing. But you have to export it. I mean, it's a named export in React router, so you have to destructure it by its name, but then you can rename it with the as keyword. Okay, from React router DOM. And then what we're going to do is we're going to wrap our app component in router. Okay. Cool. So under the hood, router is just context. So basically, essentially, inside this router component is a context that's providing app and all of its children access to all the router properties. That's how kind of router is working under the hood. So that's all set and good to go. So router's installed. Okay, we can now use router going forward along the different parts of our application. Now let's set up our global state. So I'm going to create a new folder or new file. And I'm just going to call this appstate.js. I'll call it appstate.jsx. And what we're going to do is we're going to create our application level state here. Okay. So there's a couple things that we need. Okay, so first I'm going to import React. So import React from React. Okay, first off, let's block off a couple areas. So first we want to define sort of what is our initial state. Okay, it's going to be the first thing we want, an initial state. So what are the pieces of information we're going to want sort of in our state right off the bat? So initial state. Okay, and that's going to, and that should be const initial state. That's going to equal an object. And first thing I want in this object is the URL. Okay, which we want from here. So I want this. Cool, and I'm going to take off that last backslash because we're generally going to want that. And I am going to take off the HTTPS for now, because when we work this locally, we're probably going to be using HTTP from localhost. So in that case, I want to take off the S. We'll add it back in when we deploy, because it'll break again once we deploy and it's secure. Okay, so that's good. That's a good starting place for now. So that's my initial state. Then we need to define our reducer. Now our reducer is a function that's going to be, so basically instead of having all these functions kind of exist within our components, what we're going to do is we're just going to create sort of one big function that handles all the different situations. This is referred to as a reducer. This is technically what you do in Redux. Use reducer was made to kind of introduce that pattern natively into React. So we're going to create a reducer function. So const reducer. Now this function always gets passed two things. It gets passed the original state. So this is the state as it is at that moment. And it gets passed an action. So we're going to have this function called dispatch whenever we want to invoke the reducer to update our state. And instead of telling it what the state should look like, we're going to pass it an action. And based on that action, the reducer will do a thing that updates the state. Okay? And we'll put that logic here. So in that case, we'll just go here. Okay. Nice. Now, cool. Now what I am going to do is we're going to, in here, what you usually generally do is you're going to imagine that generally the action that gets passed, okay, the action generally equals an object. And an object generally has generally two properties. Type, okay, which is going to be a string that tells us which action we're looking to do. Okay, and then we're going to have a payload, which is going to have whatever. You know, it could have numbers, it could have another object, an array. It has whatever is going to be needed for that particular scenario. Okay, we'll see, you know, we'll cross that bridge. And generally what's going to happen is that we have a switch. And the switch is going to be based on the action type. Okay, so based on the action type, this function will do different things. Whatever it returns becomes the new state. That's generally how this works. So right now, I'm just going to include default. We'll add stuff as we go along. But we're just going to have a default, and that's just going to return the state as it is. So basically, right now I don't have any particular actions, but the idea is that, and we'll add them as we go along. So essentially all of our application logic really kind of ends up living in here, in the reducer, because all our state changes are really going to happen here. Okay. Cool. Good. Okay, so we have that set up. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a component that is going to do everything we need to provide this reducer provide. And technically, if you use my library, use data store, it technically does what we're doing for you. So a lot of this boilerplate you don't have to do. But this way you know how to do this natively in React without having to download my library, use data store. Okay, so next thing we want to do is create a component. So we're going to call this const app state. So it's the application level state. equals props. Well, I don't think we need to pass it any props, but just in case. Okay, and there's a couple things we need to do. We need to create context. That needs to be done outside of the component. So let's make a little section here. We will call this app context. Okay, and this creates a context object. So const app context equals react dot create context, and it'll be initiated as null. Cool. Okay, so that's the context. That's just going to be the object that provides the state to everything. And then we need to create a reducer, so we're going to use the use reducer hook. So const, and the way they use reducer hooks is a lot like useState, where basically you get your state and a function. Okay, so I'm going to get my state, so we're going to call this, we'll just call it state, and then you get back a function called dispatch. The difference between dispatch is, again, set state, you usually specify exactly what you want to change the state to. Dispatch, we're just going to pass the action to the reducer. Okay, and so I'm going to say equals use reducer. Okay, and if I remember correctly, we're going to be passing in the reducer first, and then the initial state. Okay, so essentially what it does is it's going to send us this initial state becomes the state, and then the dispatch function, we pass it an action, which it then runs by the reducer function. Okay, and let me just I always like to double check. So use reducer syntax. I always forget if I get those backwards or not. Syntax. Use reducer. Here we go. Use reducer. Yep, it's reducer, then the initial state. Good. Okay, so we set that up just right. Cool. And then all we're going to do is that this app.state is just going to return some very basic JSX, where we're going to wrap the app context provider, which is a component. Again, whenever you use context, it creates this provider component. So there's an app context provider and a consumer. And actually, let me separate this out. This is the app state component. Okay. And that sounds good to me. Okay. And that's going to wrap around the children. So props.children. Okay. Basically does the same thing that this is essentially kind of how the browser router works on the inside. It has a provider and it wraps it around its children. So save. Okay, so that component is done. Good. Now we're going to create a custom hook so that way you can pull that context wherever you need it. Okay, so we're going to create a use app state hook, because typically what you'd have to do is you have to do like use context and then pass in the context. But this way you don't have to do as many steps. We're just setting up this boilerplate. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to const use app state equals a function, and all this function does is return the result of react dot use context to the app context. Okay, and what that does is just pulls out whatever we provide. On that note, the provider hasn't provided anything, so we need to make sure that's the case. So value equals, and whatever this value prop is, that's what the provider is providing to the entire application. So I wanted to provide an object that includes the state and dispatch. Okay, the state and dispatch. So that way those are available to the whole app. So the provider is providing the state and the dispatch. So now our whole app will have access to it. Any component that needs it will then use this hook to pull that information out. Okay, so that's cool. So now all we really need to do now is export. We're going to export an object Or what I'll do is I'll just export these two things individually. So I'm going to export this const use app state. I'm going to export the component because that's really all we need. Okay, everything else can stay within the context of this file. So export the app state component, export the use apps hook, and then the last thing we need to do just to get all set up, index.js. We're also going to import the app state component from /app state, and then that's going to get wrapped around router. And this way you don't have to worry about, well, this is technically all done. So all the state is provided to the entire component tree. Technically, even the router has access to it, not that it'll need it. Okay, save. Okay, and so that's kind of what will look like. So now you have application level state provided, and all you have to do in any component you want to use that state in is you just use the use app state hook to pull that information in, and now you have application level state. So that now we've set up our project. Our React boilerplate is set up. What we're going to do next is, well, start building the project. I'll see you guys in the next video, and we'll start building stuff out. Ciao.